Thanks everyone. We've looked at the material change of use example. Now we're going to look at a more complex one. It's a subdivision, or as we call it here, an ROL, reconfiguring of a lot. So let's begin. We have an application for an 8-lot community title subdivision at 250 and 252 Gilston Road, Gilston. Here's a picture of the site. In the have the Nerang River, Bridge Creek, Gilston Road. Here's the context of the site. We have the Grange Golf Course, Nerang River, Bridge Creek. We have Peter Mills' land where he's over the last 10 years subdivided here, and we have Highland Park here, and I think the Pacific View estate runs through here to the Pacific Motorway. The application is for an 8-lot community title subdivision in two stages. Stage 1, 3 lots here, and stage 2, 5 lots towards the Nerang River. The lot sizes range from around 3,700 square metres to just shy of 8,000 square metres. Some information on the site. Once again, it's a community title subdivision. I'll just explain what that is a bit later. Subject site is just shy of 60,000 square metres, or 6 hectares. They've got fairly large building envelopes. As you can see on the plans, they range from 1,200 square metres to around 1,900 square metres. There's a lot of common property, particularly around the existing dam. They're proposing a 30-metre buffer to the Nerang River and a 10-metre buffer to Bridge Creek. Key issues, we'll go through the 03 scheme first, and then we'll go through the draft city plan. So some of the issues we'll look at are well, we've already jumped the gun. We're saying this application conflicts, so we're saying, but we're going to look at the DEO's land use themes, the key objectives of the Gilston structure plan, the intent of the emerging communities domain. We've got the reconfiguring of a lot, and we've got the natural wetland areas and waterways constraint code. In terms of the draft city plan, we'll go to the strategic framework. We'll then, once again, the strategic framework's the key, but we'll look at still mandatorily going through the rural zone, the nature conservation overlay code, and the reconfiguring of a lot code. For this application, the site is located there. It's in the emerging communities domain and within what's called the Gilston structure plan. Application's a little bit complex because it's in 2 precincts. It's in the rural precinct and the open space and conservation and recreation precinct. Under the draft city plan 2015, the site is in the rural zone, and part of the site's in the rural landscape and environmental protection precinct. Just getting back to the 2003 planning scheme, some of the key principles that we discussed in the first one. What is the level of assessment? We have to determine the suitability of the proposed land use. 2003 scheme, it's a bottom-up approach. We have to look at the non-compliance with any PCs, requiring further assessment against the higher order provisions of the planning scheme, but we must still consider the planning scheme for impact assessment. We're still looking at the whole of the scheme. Right, we have the table of assessment, which is G. Under our tables of assessment, I think they're A, B, C, D, E, F and G. Because this is a reconfiguring of a lot, we go to table of assessment G to help us with what the level of assessment is. We have a very interesting situation in our current 03 scheme where it's a bit of an anomaly, and a lot of developers use it as a loophole, but often a community title subdivision triggers a code assessment land use as opposed to an impact, even though they might have many lots as part of that community title. Luckily here, in our impact assessment column, it's got when you're resulting in more than 4 lots, it is triggered to impact. So if they're going for 3 lots, Brock, it actually would be a code assessment outcome for a community title, but because it's 4 lots within a community title, irrespective of that, it's still impact assessment. In the draft city plan 2015, I think they're removing the community title. Emma, is that correct? I think they're removing the community title part from the 2015 scheme.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, okay. Sorry, Emma, I knew you did some work on it. I didn't want to put you on the spot. Right, the emerging communities domain, the intent and key objectives. Look, I won't bore you with all of those, but Brock and I have had a look through that. We probably believe the last one's relevant. The retention and enhancement of a viable nature conservation network as the local area develops in accordance with the adopted structure plan. So that's the important key intent and key objective in the community emerging communities domain for this application. In the emerging communities, we have several performance criteria and acceptable solutions. Of relevance is the acceptable solution. The site exceeds 1 detached dwelling per lot and is consistent with the Gilston structure plan. The PC says accommodation density must be low to maintain and enhance the quality of the rural landscape, farmland, natural landscapes and hinterland scenic backdrop. So we're now going to touch upon, this is an 8-lot community title subdivision with community title lot sizes between 4,000 and 8,000 square metres. Just for your own information, the park living domain, the minimum lot size is 8,000 square metres with an average lot size of 4,000. So the park living is the zone that's even closer into urban activity than this. This is in the rural. This is more sort of a rural intent. So you've immediately got a situation where, in Brock, in my opinion, 8 lots is really way too much, way intensive in terms of the community, in terms of what the community emerging communities domain is trying to achieve. So we believe there's potentially a conflict with PC2 there. The building setback, all buildings are setback not less than 30 metres from the top of the high bank. You'll remember that to the Nerang River that was 30 metres, but to Bridge Creek was only 10. So, you know, potentially this application could compromise existing vegetation and ecological patterns. So we believe there's a potential for a conflict with PC5 as well. AS15, the subdivision of land for any particular use is consistent with the provisions of any relevant structure plan. We'll get to that in a sec. We'll show you the Gilston structure plan. The PC15, any subdivision of land must be consistent with the objectives for a balanced management of land within the city and must be informed by the preparation of a detailed land use planning investigation. So it is important to note that the emerging communities makes reference to the Gilston structure plan, which is here. So the Gilston structure plan has some key purposes and objectives. It's characterised by rural holdings with land either utilised for rural purposes or retained in its natural state. Due to topography, large tracts of the Gilston area remain undisturbed and support any array of flora and fauna. Our council has received numerous requests to permit urban development in the Gilston area. Given that the urban area would significantly alter the character of the Gilston area, councils recognise the need to formulate the structure plan to ensure development is coordinated. But the key objectives are to retain the semi-rural character, enhance and protect waterways, riparian zones, remnant vegetation, and ensure that there's ecological sustainability. Having 8 lots on this site, we have serious concerns that we can actually achieve that. So at this stage, we're considering there's actually a conflict with the purpose and key objectives of the Gilston structure plan. Right, open space intent. To preserve and enhance the waterways, areas of remnant vegetation, scenic value, visual prominent areas, and to retain, protect and rehabilitate the linkages between important natural areas. If you have 8 lots on this site with building envelopes, effluent disposal areas, roads, you're really starting to compromise the site. Rural intent and key objectives. The purpose of the rural intent is to retain the rural settlement pattern. This land includes areas which are physically constrained or unable to be serviced. This site can't be serviced. There's a desire to protect environmentally sensitive areas. It has visual character. So we believe this application potentially conflicts with the rural intent. So we're going to the specific development code, the ROL lot code. So AS 1.1.1, the minimum lot area, minimum lot frontage, minimum width of any access strip or easement, and the maximum ratio of lot to depth are consistent with the provisions of the table. We go to the PC. Lots must have an appropriate area and dimensions to enable density of land uses to be consistent with the intended character of the local area. We've got water quality impacts, retention of ecological significant areas and remnant vegetation. So we believe we have a conflict there. Neighbourhood design and character, the PC6. Subdivision of land must provide for a neighbourhood with a strong and positive identity, appropriate response to site characteristics and urban setting. Just remember, this is not the park living domain. It's in the Gilston Structure Plan, which has a rural precinct, not even a park living domain. These lots would possibly be not even large enough for park living purposes. Now we're to the natural wetland areas and natural waterways, conflicts with the PCs and that constraint code. We must have buffers must be provided incorporating development setbacks of dimensions and character that will ensure the development does not result in a negative impact upon the long-term viability of ecologically significant areas. PC4, all development including structures, fill, infrastructure and services must be set back from ecologically significant areas. We've got Bridge Creek, we've got Nerang River. So just summing up, we must consider the proposal against the higher order provisions of the planning scheme, planning strategies, land use themes, DEOs. The development must not compromise the DEOs. So in this particular area, Brock and I have looked at this application. We've gone through all the applicable codes. We believe that there's a lot of PCs that are not complying. The intent of the Gilston Structure Plan, the intent of the ROL code. So we must go to the DEOs now. And we've come across, and we believe the DEO Social 1, the establishment, conservation, enhancement of local character and the promotion of distinctive local identity and sense of place. We believe that this application significantly compromises that. Just a few of the, I suppose, the planning objectives which support this DEO. Preservation of ecologically significant areas, I think we've said that a number of times. Provide continuity of open space and ecological corridors, adequate buffers, preserve significant natural areas, to preserve the distinctive character of the area. So we're of the opinion that this application under the 2003 scheme doesn't comply with many PCs, doesn't comply with the intent of codes, and is in contravention of the DEO. So this application's not looking good under the 2003 scheme. Now we'll get to the 2015 scheme, and as we went before, we have the code assessment table, and then we have the impact below. So the code assessment says if they basically want the application under a code assessment outcome results in no lots with an area less than the minimum lot size identified on the minimum lot size overlay map. So we actually go down, and we're in the rural level of assessment. And that talks about 100 hectares. So this site is around 6.8 hectares, Brock?
Yeah, that's 6 hectares.
So 6 or 7 hectares, and they're trying to get 8 lots. But what this is saying in the 2015 scheme, in the rural zone, that they need 100 hectares to basically subdivide. So they're just nowhere near that. So we've got an extreme conflict with the draft city plan here. And,
I think it's just important to add as well that it's where you've got that rural landscape and environment precinct triggered on the site as well. It also does say there are no additional lots, and it's quite clear. And you see that later on in the codes as well, in the rural zone.
Okay, thanks, Brock. And don't forget, these are the relevant assessment criteria for us to go through. So, the application triggers impact assessment. Quite clearly, there's not a lot of support already, even though the limited assessment we've already done, there's not a lot of support for a subdivision on this site. So the table identifies assessment criteria. Up the top's the strategic framework. So reiterate that's the first thing we look at. After the strategic framework, we'll get into the applicable codes. So as we discussed before, there are 6 themes. Obviously, we're not trying to create a livable place here, so theme 1's not relevant. We're not making modern centres. We're not strengthening and diversifying the economy. We're certainly not improving transport outcomes. But theme 5 is relevant, and that's living with nature. So certainly the natural landscape areas, green space network, nature conservation, and the coastal wetland and watercourse areas. So Brock and I consider that the theme 5 is relevant. Of note, though, is that the intensity they're trying to develop on the site with 8 lots almost implies they're trying to create a livable place. So you could sort of argue, well, theme 1 is relevant, but for all the wrong purposes. We're trying to create livable places in the right locations in the city. We're not trying to create it here. So even though we're going to look at theme 5, Brock and I consider that there's a major conflict with the theme 1, because for all intents and purposes, having 8 lots there is a sort of a livable place. And we basically state that in the strategic intent, livable places. So part of the assessment, Brock will probably have some dialogue, or part of his assessment he'd probably go into that. But the major one we're going to focus on is the theme living with nature, and we're going to look at the outcomes, the elements on natural landscaped areas, green space network, nature conservation, and the coastal wetland and watercourse specific outcomes. That's just some dialogue on what the strategic intent is in terms of places, urban renewal. I'm not going to read it all, but I think the last sentence is relevant. Avoiding sprawl outside our urban areas will protect our world-class environment and spectacular scenic amenity, and help to ensure our investment in public infrastructure is environmentally and financially sustainable. So that's a really important theme, and I think having 8 lots here, look, it's a burden on our infrastructure. We can't supply these people public transport. Look, it's just simply not envisaged that for 8 lots on this site in terms of the draft city plan. And the subject, and as this says, the subject site, it's outside the urban area. So the pink colour is the urban area, and to the west is outside the urban area. It's a similar pattern to the South East Queensland Regional Plan urban footprint. I don't think it's a mirror image, David, but it's for all intents and purposes, it gives us a guide.
It excludes rural residential.
Yeah. Okay. So it's actually outside the urban area. It's the natural landscaped area under settlement patterns, and I think that's quite important to note. Sally's application that we did first, that was in the urban area. It was in a defined settlement pattern, so development and growth was contemplated. Here you're in a natural landscaped area in terms of settlement patterns. Urban development is simply not contemplated. Right, so we'll go to the first one in terms of the themes under the strategic intent of living with, which is living with nature. I'll just quickly go through a few. I know you're all pressed for time. A comprehensive green space network of natural features is enhanced, maintained and protected for the nature, conservation and recreation needs of the city, and enhances the city's powerful image of green, gold and blue. Non-urban land is protected to maintain the extent and diversity of the city's natural and productive rural landscapes. Natural landscaped areas element. Natural landscaped areas are retained and enhanced to perform essential functions such as nature conservation, cultural heritage, scenic amenity and other green space values. Getting to the green space network element, specific outcomes. The diverse green space network provides recreation, community wellbeing, biodiversity, scenic amenity and so on. The city's green space also contains smaller open spaces and corridors not shown on the strategic framework maps that provide important green space values. Important network links. Green space open network. We're looking at watercourses, protecting the vegetation, wildlife and ecological corridors, protecting scenic amenity and so forth. Nature conservation element. There's a common theme here. Ecological sensitive features are protected. Development in all other areas is designed to incorporate practical operational solutions, including the consideration of alternative designs to minimise the impacts on the biodiversities found on this site. Coastal wetland areas. The integrity of the catchment areas is maintained in natural landscaped areas, rural production areas and rural residential areas. Disturbance to existing landforms, ecological features is avoided or minimised. So we've gone through the major parts of the strategic intent, and Brock and I have come to the conclusion that this application is major conflict to the strategic intent and the strategic framework. So at this stage, the application is not looking good in the 03 scheme, it's not looking good in the 2015. So once again, it's a top-down approach, and we've gone through the strategic intent, but we still need to go through the applicable codes to help reinforce our position on it. So there's still an obligation to go through the Rural Zone Code, the Reconfiguring of a Lot Code, General Development Provisions Code, and to a lesser extent on-site Sewerage Facilities Code, Vegetation Management Code, Healthy Waterways Code, and importantly any overlay codes, bushfire, flood, landslide, and sensitive land use separation. So just quickly, the Rural Zone Code. So the purpose of the Rural Zone Code is to provide for non-rural uses that are compatible with the landscape character of the rural area and do not compromise the long-term use of the land for rural purposes. It's quite funny, the South East Queensland Regional Plan defines rural uses or non-urban uses as basically 2 dwellings on a site. Any more than that, and that's considered to be an urban use. So even though we're not assessing the application today under the South East Queensland Regional Plan, you've got a clear direction that they consider an urban use to be more than 2 primary dwelling units. 8 lots, 8 primary dwelling units, that's far in expectation of the South East Queensland Regional Plan. And even our Rural Zone Code, if you go down to the bottom, talks about providing low-rise, very low-intensity residential accommodation. So quite clearly we believe that there is a conflict with the Rural Zone Code as well as the strategic framework. Purpose and overall outcomes continued. It's about character, large expanses of workable open land framed by vegetation and watercourses, which is sparsely populated with low-rise, very low-intensity dwellings and rural buildings. The built form is set back to provide an appropriate level of privacy that is expected in a rural setting, is carefully sited to ensure buildings and structures are integrated into the rural landscapes. So we believe quite clearly the 8 lots do not achieve this. Rural landscape and environmental precinct, so we said that there was a precinct that was within the rural zone. The purpose of the rural landscape and environmental precinct will be achieved through the following overall outcome. Land uses do not impact upon the ecologically significant features, landscape and scenic amenity values of the land. Natural landscape and environmental areas are protected and conserved. So the Rural Zone Code, we've got the purpose of the code, we've got character, built form, lot design, the variations, which is the Rural Landscape and Environmental Precinct, and the accessible criteria. And some accessible criteria with the Rural Landscape and Environmental Precinct. I'll just go to PC6. It actually says new lots are not created. So this application creates 8 lots in the rural area. So quite clearly there's a major conflict here. Nature conservation overlay. Purpose of the nature overlay code is to identify and protect ecologically significant areas. Purpose of the code will be achieved through the following outcomes. Ecologically sensitive features will be identified, protected, enhanced to maintain flora and fauna diversity. Just down the page, buffer areas are provided between ecologically significant features and any proposed impacts. We have, I suppose, just one. I know it's only an acceptable outcome, but that talks about buffers to wetlands and watercourses of 100 metres. I know it's only an acceptable outcome, and they're entitled to come up with alternatives, but you've got some pretty significant buffers in the Nature Conservation Overlay Code that this application just clearly doesn't meet. I think we're talking 30 metres from the Rang River and 10 metres from Bridge Creek. PO3, development within the hinterland core habitat systems were to protect the ecologically significant features and associated buffers. So there's a lot of duplication here, but there's a clear message. Nature Conservation Overlay Code talks about wetland and watercourse. The AO, only an acceptable outcome, but buffers of at least 100 metres. So that's a common theme coming up, as well as the subdivision of lots. Specifically, the reconfiguring of a lot code. I won't bore you with all that's in there, but B, reconfiguring a lot allows for increased yields in close proximity to public transport, retail, commercial, community and recreation facilities. So we've got a conflict here because quite clearly B is in relation to an urban form where we're trying to increase concentrated settlements of people. The light rail, we're trying to bump up our densities in there. This is not an area we want to contemplate for development. So you've got a major conflict with the purpose of the ROL code just there. Neighbour design, character and integration, PEO 15 of the ROL code. Development provides a neighbour with a strong and positive identity, you know, with clearly readable streets. Well, we don't want that. We don't want a neighbourhood with a strong and positive identity here. So we've gone through the draft city plan, and Brock and I quite clearly think that the 8 lots proposed is totally out of the question when it comes to the strategic intent, purposes of the codes. So this application is going to be recommended for refusal 03 and 2015. Just for a quick sum up, so we've gone through the 03 scheme, subject to impact assessment, bottom-up approach. We're looking at the acceptable solutions, the PCs, the intent of the codes, going to the strategic intent. Sorry, I'm using terminology under the draft city plan already, David. Planning strategies, land use themes, DEOs. We believe the application conflicts at all levels within the 03 scheme. Then we went to the draft city plan, also subject to the impact assessment. We went to the strategic framework first. We went through the framework as a whole, and we believe that in terms of the applicable themes and elements, this application was in conflict with many of those waterways, the greening approach, the nature conservation, those major elements, and there was a conflict there. We then went to the codes, and that reinforced this application is totally inappropriate there. So there was a conflict with the strategic framework, and that was reinforced through the applicable codes. Look, that's the end of the presentation. Are there any specific questions on the ROL assessment? Rob.
David, just a question for you. I'll go back to the zoning. Is there a specific reason with the rural landscape and environment precinct how it was hatched, particularly on this site? Most of the times you see it with the site to the north where the hatching goes over the whole site. This particular site, and I haven't seen this very often in the scheme when looking through particular sites where you actually see it, obviously it's got an irregular shape and it's only over parts of the site. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, look, there's probably a very long answer to that, but it will be subject to further debate with council in the coming weeks. But long story short, if I can make it short, the current rural domain of the 03 scheme has both an agricultural and a conservation intent. Okay? Under a QPP scheme, the rural zone does not have any conservation intent. It's very much a farm it, clear it and farm it. That's what gave birth to the landscape and environment precinct, was the concept that I think like 50% of our hinterland is currently included in the rural domain. So to simply put that in a rural zone was sending the wrong message. Our hinterland is all about conservation and biodiversity and scenic amenity. The rural zone of the QPP is the absolute opposite. It's clear it, farm it, and use it intensively. But then we started to strike a problem in that a lot of our conservation overlay mapping is quite generic. Okay, so it's detailed, but it might cover that whole site. So then what we started to do was say, well, if you have a look at sites like that, you would either pull up an overlay map, and the overlay map would only show the parts that we've got in the hatch. Or what has happened is the planners in my team have tried to do a best fit. They've looked at aerial photography, and they've tried to only include those areas in the precinct which are covered by the bench. And that's very intentional because if you're outside the precinct, you can farm. Okay, and a lot of our hinterland in our valleys you can currently farm. If you're within the precinct though, precinct says the opposite. It says you really don't have a strong farming outcome here. So if that's been done correctly, what you'll see is the areas of that site that are reasonably clear have been taken out of the precinct. The areas that are covered by the veg or due to be covered by the biodiversity values, they've been included in the precinct. Now we know we haven't got this 100% right, and we're going to have to work on this over the coming, probably as part of number one, but we believe the intent is sound. Okay. Another outcome here is things like the Numinbah Valley. Numinbah Valley at its lower base is very clear, and there are actually agricultural activities happening there. What we've sought to do is allow those activities to continue in the rural zone by taking them out of the precinct. But as you start to get higher, as you start to hit your foothills and the steeper slopes where they're more vegetated, you'll start to see the precinct kick in. But to be really frank, it's currently a point of great debate with our council regarding its origins and the mapping. In some cases, particularly around the cane lands, we'll probably be looking to rectify some of that mapping next week. Does that help you at all?
Yeah, no, it's good explanation about it, yeah.
To really, the final example I'll give you is intensive ag under the QPP. You know, in the rural zone outside the precinct can be done as self-assessment. So you can just go in there and start planting and farming, heavy machinery type thing. But those intensive ag land uses aren't even currently listed in the landscape and environment precinct. Okay, to send a very clear message that it's a different type of outcome.
David, I've got a question for you. It was the MCU component. We're dabbling in the strategic framework, and then we're going to the codes. So where it's a top-down approach. On the application for the shop, possibly the acoustic attenuation solution, say, could be a 3-metre high fence in order to comply with the acoustic requirements. Under the strategic framework, it could be construed, particularly by applicants, that it's a big picture and then sort of tailoring down so they don't have to get into the specifics. But Mrs. Smith, who lives on the other side of the 3-metre high fence, might consider herself adversely impacted by that fence. Could it be construed by a developer that if they can, in their opinion, comply with the nature of the strategic intent, they don't necessarily need to comply with those very, very small scale AOs, POs of the applicable codes?
Okay, that's probably a question better answered by a lawyer.
Yeah.
But my understanding is the strategic framework will override to the extent of any inconsistency. Okay? It doesn't mean that you literally, for an impact assessable DA, only look at the strategic framework. Okay, so if you look at the strategic framework and you are consistent, the use that you've got is consistent with the framework, you then keep going down into the further details of the codes. Okay, and that can give you grounds for conditioning, etc., etc. But if you started the application and you're not even consistent with the strategic framework, then you can also keep looking down the codes for further justification why you potentially should be conditioning an approval or a potential refusal. In this current case, I think what you identified very, very well was the very first strategic outcome in the whole city plan is about containing urban development to the designated urban area. So very early on in your assessment against a framework, you're going to come up across a problem very early on. But yeah, I don't think you should be not looking at lower order codes. The framework only overrides where there's an inconsistency.
Right.
Okay?
Thank you.
So it's still, an impact assessment is still a whole of scheme assessment. And that's, in my opinion, that is articulated in the legislation.
Some of us have got dart at 12. Well, it's a busy morning. Thank you, David. 4 minutes. Couple of things before you go. There's some evaluation forms we'd love for you to fill out and be honest. Also, Steve Brett embarked on the first workshop. We've just completed the second. The idea is to have a series of workshops leading up to the draft city plan coming live. So look, here was our interpretation of what you needed with some working examples. We'd like your honest feedback as to how we can improve, and so when we have our next session at the end of January, early February, we're providing you with something that you actually want. So maybe on the evaluation forms or something, can you be honest with your feedback as to what you want out of it next time? That would be really, really appreciated. Thanks so much, Brock. Thanks so much, Sal. Thanks so much, David. Thanks for organising it, Alison and Sharon and Julie. Thank you. Thanks.